So thanks for joining us today. Kids are gone already. They know where that quality is over there. And as I mentioned, I think last week, Aaron, my son, thinks that time flies much quicker out there than it does in here. So, I apologize. I also am reminded I used to go to a church years ago when the associate pastor would preach. I would often tell my wife, oh yes, this Sunday they will hold us hostage, because he would go for an hour and a half. And so I won't be that long, I promise. I also don't have sermons after sermons, which is also something that our friends who've been in the church tradition might know. We have a team from Tennessee. I'm going to embarrass you and say, hey, can you wave your hand? Whoa, look at all these people from Tennessee. Each one of them told me that they're going to move into the city right away and start working with us. So, or at least they're going to start thinking about it, I suppose. Anyways, this morning we were kind of working through this idea of who we are designed and created to be, and we continue that in Genesis 4. And what we're kind of trying to lay out and what we're trying to really set before us is this idea of how God designed us and how the gospel really anchors us and pushes us back into who we are. And with that, as we get to it, I have, as is my custom, our map of where we're going. And these are our three kind of points. We have crouching sin, man, beast, bird, and man of ransom. And so if you know me at some level, or even if a lot of folks here are just getting to know me, I, Dustin, have often across my life gotten into what I'd call fits of mania. These fits of mania are unique. Often I get triggered in such a way that I feel invincible and unstoppable. And then I approach situations in confrontational ways in a way I normally would not. And as I've been working on myself and working through this, I've realized that, man, that feeling of invincibility, that's not real. I am still very much vulnerable. I am still very much a normal human being. And I've been really parsing through some of this that, for each of us, we each have maybe moments where we do something that makes us somewhat feel less than who we are. And sometimes we do things that make us feel more than who we are. And that's kind of where I wanted to center this morning, is that one of the themes of the Bible is that every time we try to become more than what God created us to be, we end up becoming something less. And so with that, we jump into the crouching sin, and this is on the heels of Genesis chapter 3. And just as a brief recap, right, that's that big fall chapter where the man and the woman are in the garden. God's like, hey, you can have all of this world, but not this one thing. And of course, they're tempted, and this beastly creature, a serpent, tempts them and says, hey, you know what? You can't trust God. And that seed of doubt creates this chasm between humanity and their creator, this distrust that God is good, that he tells the truth, and that he's for us. And so after the fall, God, he shows up and he explains kind of the results and the conclusions of what a life directed by yourself looks like. And then the story continues with their children in Genesis chapter 4. It says, now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. And she said, I've gotten a man with the help from the Lord. This is really reminiscent of just the few pages prior, where God creates Adam and looks for someone suitable, right? And so he creates woman out of man. So here a few pages later, there's a man that comes out of a woman. It's supposed to be like, wow, there's a mirror here. Wow, we're really all working together from the same thing to the same thing. And then it says that she bore his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep. And Cain was this worker of the ground. And in the course of time, Cain brought the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, but Abel also brought an offering of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. I always was confused. If you've known this story, it's like both people bring something of sacrifice to God, but the text says that God had regard for one of their sacrifices and not the other. I, a big person of justice, I am like really upset with God here because I'm like, well, they both offered something, God. But why would God favor or have regard for Abel but not his brother? And what's really interesting is that as this idea develops over our book, we start to see particularly that generosity in Scripture is often connected to self-sacrifice and what's first given. Oh, it's not up there anymore. Can you put the 4 back up there? What I wanted to point out as we try to wrestle through and think through why God would maybe show favor to my neighbor and not to me, in this place, it's Abel bringing his firstborn of his flock, the firstborn, the one that you could count on, whereas maybe Cain just brings a general offering. Why would this be significant is because it's like maybe if you had a sales job and maybe you sold cars. Maybe your family has a budget and you've got to sell a certain amount of cars a month. The idea of generosity in the Bible is first fruits, or firstborn, like you bring the first. And so it's like, man, you commit at the dealership that the first car you sell, regardless of the profit it brings in, whether there's like a high margin or a low margin, you say the first amount of profit, the first amount of whatever comes in, I'm going to give to God. And that could be really dangerous because if you sell a Corvette in your first month, man, you might make like $10,000 in profit. That might be your budget for the month, and you might not sell another car. But because you have faith that what you're going to give to God, you're trusting that He's going to continue to sustain and take care of you. This is what the author of Hebrews says in chapter 11, verse 4. The author of Hebrews in our New Testament says that by faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, and through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. The New Testament authors looked back at this story and they said, what's happening here is God is who God has always been. God cares about our faith and our trust in Him, that we would believe He would take care of us. And so the way we live our lives, if we align ourselves that way faithfully, it often looks like self-sacrifice and care towards our neighbor, often at risk to ourselves. And so in verse 5 of Genesis chapter 4, it says that as for Cain and his offering, God had no regard. So Cain's response was anger. And so it says that his face fell. And there's something then in Cain, if you can imagine like the story of the Bible, this is really just what? Day one sort of instance. You have the whole world. There is abundance everywhere. And I know like right now we talk about scarcity and resources across the earth. Well, this is like, the idea is like, man, this is the beginning. There's enough for everybody. Cain has it good. It's just that Abel has it better. For some reason, Cain's looking at the fact that God is showing favor because God's seen the faith of Abel and blessing him, and Cain is riled up with some sort of jealousy of sorts. He is looking at his neighbor saying, I wish I just had more favor. He's looking at his neighbor saying, what I have isn't enough. And there is something about that is, I believe, in each of us. It's definitely in me. That I am rarely ever satisfied with what I have. A simple example of this is, man, I only get a new iPhone every 2 years, but you better believe I'm watching every year for what the new iPhone's going to have. And I'm sitting there saying, like, man, maybe I should get this year's iPhone, forget my whole 2-year economically faithful plan. I'm just going to dive in. Don't get me started on the Apple Vision Pro. Had I not been married, I would have dropped $4,500 so that I could sit in my living room to be on my computer in my eyes. Totally there. There is something in me that just strives and wants more. And you better believe that that is made more apparent to me when I see someone who has that. When I see someone living in the more that I want. And that, I believe, is what's happening with Cain. He sees his brother and the favor and blessing that God's showing him. And even though he has, all of the earth, even though he is in a healthy family, firstborn, right? Favored. Man, it's just not what Abel has. And whether it is in Cain's heart or in my heart or in your heart, we end up doing this comparison all the time. Whether you're on social media scrolling from TikTok to TikTok and seeing like, man, that family, that person, they're doing things and living in a way that I want to live. My children are often amazed at the YouTubers and their mansions and their Lambos and their Teslas. And my children are like, wow, look at them. They're all rich. I once asked my youngest daughter, Sinai, I said, do you want to be a YouTuber when you grow up? And she said, so certainly, with such pose, she said, no, I just want to be rich. And so whether I'm actually like interacting with my neighbor or whether I'm interacting online with people I don't know, there's always this thing of comparison going on. And what I want to make clear is that the comparison in and of itself is not bad. It's how we act past the comparison. For Cain, he sees the favor in his neighbor's life, his literal brother, and he's moved in anger. This anger built and seated on injustice. Cain is filled with mania. He's going to take justice into his own hands to make things fair in his mind. There is something endemic in sin that makes me jealous for the generosity of God in other people's lives. And God, just a chapter before, told the man and the woman that thing, that they could have everything but this. And then they made that comparison with the serpent in the garden from last week. And they looked at that tree and they said, I even want that, which I cannot have, which I was instructed and told it doesn't belong to me. I have all the fruit, all of the bounty, all of the generosity and abundance of life, but the thing that I cannot have, I still want it so. This is very much what's going on in Cain's life. And so the Lord shows up, and he says to Cain, the Lord shows up because he sees this stirring in the heart of this man, and he says, Cain, why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, you will be accepted, won't you? If you don't do well, listen to this. He says, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, towards you. I don't like contrary, but for or towards you, but you must rule over it. He says there is something beast-like crouching near this decision. And its desire is to take over you, but you have to rule over it. And already on page 4 of our Bible, we're seeing the results of humanity's fall that God promised. In Genesis 3:15, if you recall, God says that he's going to put this enmity between the serpent and the woman, and between the serpent's offspring and her offspring. Cain being Eve's offspring literally, and then this crouching sin, the offspring of what was in the garden. And then he says this, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. These things locked in this struggle of distrust that we all have innately with each other. And so here, Cain has to choose the same thing his parents had to choose. Am I going to listen to the voice of God in my life and what he wants and what he says is good? Or am I going to do something else? And so in verse 8, it says, Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel, and he killed him. We didn't take long to get from paradise to hell. And then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? Cain's response is, I don't know. Am I his keeper? I am also reminded of our chapter before where God is moving in the garden after the fall, and he's asking Adam, where are you? Here in this next story, God is moving in Cain's life, asking, where is your brother? And maybe Cain's being honest. He doesn't know where people go when they die. He has no idea what happens post-life. In the story of the Bible, this isn't just the first murder. This is the first death. There is no concept, no idea in a paradise of what that looks like. Maybe this is honesty. And then the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood I hear crying to me from the ground. And now you're cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. And it says, when you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You're going to be a fugitive and wanderer on the earth. The Bible has this theme that reoccurs through the whole book. That when you and I try to become something greater than what we are, we become something less. Whether it is ignoring the voice of God and taking the fruit to try to be like God, to elevate ourselves above others, or whether it's looking at the favor in our neighbor's life and pushing them down so we would be higher than too. There's something beastly about living for ourselves and trying to make ourselves great. Which leads us to the next part on our map, man, beast, bird. So there is this story in the book of Daniel. It's one of these stories you don't hear often in church because it's weird. But if we really open our ears to what the Bible is saying, it can make some more sense to us. And I love this in chapter 4. I think when people think of Daniel, they think of Daniel in the lion's den. They think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. But when I think of Daniel, or they think of like Revelation and stuff like that. But when I think of Daniel, I think of this amazing story about a king who turns into a beast, bird, man creature. And this is in Daniel 4:28. And so what's happening in the story of Daniel, if you read it, is there's constantly this move, right? There's this kingdom of Babylon that has conquered Israel. It has enslaved all of the people of Israel and has brought those people back to their kingdom in Babylon to work as slaves. And in the story of Daniel, the king is starting to interact with these Jewish people and finding that they're quite wise and that the things they do are in fact blessed. And so what ends up happening is the king starts to collaborate with them and makes some of them his magicians and magistrates. People think of like, for lack of a better word, think of Jafar. The king of Babylon's like, man, I'm going to make all these Jewish people like Jafar. They're going to be my viceroy that gives me wisdom. But of course, unlike Disney's Aladdin, these people are pro-God and goodness. And so there's this move back and forth between, am I going to listen to the voice of God through these people, or am I going to do things for myself as the king of Babylon? And so we pick up there, and it says, all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar, and at the end of the 12 months, he was walking on the roof of his royal palace in Babylon. He goes to the high point in his city, and he looks across the city, and he says, is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power, as a royal resident, and for the glory of my majesty? Can you imagine that? He's standing on top of this high place looking over the kingdom, and he says, I did that. I'm great, and it all reflects me. Kind of ignoring the move of God prior in chapters. This is kind of King Nebuchadnezzar's foil. And it says, while the words were still in the king's mouth, like he was still saying them, while the words were still in his mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it's spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and he gives it to whom he will. And then in verse 33, it says, immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men. He ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. Important, they look like that. They aren't actually bird's claws. It's like his nails have grown so long that when you looked at it, they looked like talons. And his hair was so long and across his body, he kind of looked bird-like. But he ate grass on the field like an ox. And this all came from this place of him exalting himself above God. He says, I've built this kingdom, and it reflects my glory and how great I am. And just in a moment, when he tried to become something greater than what God made him to be, the curse of Eden sits with him and reveals who he truly is in this moment. Some sort of beast. You know, human reality is that we are constantly comparing ourselves to each other and to our own work. We build and we create, and we look at that and we say that reflects how great I am. Whether it's your work at your job, whether it's your ministry and how large it is or how great it might work, whether it's your engineering career or the time that you spend serving other people, we look to the things we build to elevate ourselves. It is endemic in humanity. And the comparison, to look at what we've built, to look at the bounty of my neighbor compared to myself, isn't wrong. It's not the comparison. It is what we pull from the comparison and how we act. It's the act of putting ourselves above our neighbor. That is innately, in these stories, the core sin issue. The thing that creates the chasm between me and God, the thing that creates the chasm between me and my neighbor, is I want to be better than them. I want to feel qualitatively better, stronger, invincible. And Jesus, he sees this, acknowledges it, and provides us a different way. That there is a way you and I can escape the crouching sin at the door of decision and escape the beastly transformation that we all undergo when we choose to elevate ourselves above others. And this is what he says in Matthew 20:25, and this is the last place on our map, the man of ransom. But Jesus called to him and he said, "You know, guys," referring to his disciples after they were arguing who's going to be great in his kingdom, Jesus pulls them together in this conversation of greatness. "Oh, you want to be great in my kingdom? I don't think you know what you're asking for." And he says this, he says, "You know that the rulers of the other nations, the Gentiles, the rulers of Babylon, the rulers of Egypt, the rulers of the Gentiles, they lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over other people." He says there is something in this world where people get power and authority, and they do not use that to make anything better other than their own status and position. He says that they use their power to lord over people, to set themselves apart as more important, more quality, more valuable. This is all true, he says. And then in verse 26, it says, "It shall not be so among you, because whoever would be great among you must be a servant. And whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The kingdom of God, as Jesus sees it, is not about receiving power to make ourselves great. But the whole ministry of Jesus is built on the truth that the power of God that we receive is used to serve our neighbor. And that, in many ways, is exactly what Jesus did. He is given the power to rule over the whole earth, to be the king of the nations. But where he diverges from us is he uses that power and authority to serve us, not to lord over us, not to coerce us to follow him and to do his will. But he uses that power to lift us up. And that devotion to his kingdom and the ways of God led him to even give up his very self as a ransom for you. Which is incredible, because we know that God qualitatively is greater than us, but that he would even give that up for you. And that is the essence of the gospel. That even though God's life for your life is not a fair trade, he is that good, that he would give you the ability to live like you were created to be. He didn't come so that we would all serve him. He says he came to serve us. And this is what the world gets wrong about the gospel. They look at our churches across America, and the world thinks that the gospel is about a spiritual hierarchy. They see this room as me at the top of this organization, and you, in some ways, listen to all the things I say. And you know why they think that? They think that because that's the world. That is how every organization and every kingdom works. That the guy at the top is the one who calls the shots, and you're here to serve him. But Jesus says that is not how my kingdom works. The great ones are the ones who are going to give themselves for their neighbor. And this is actually what the religious get wrong about the gospel as well. The religious believe that the pastor, though he does have a calling to serve the Lord, they sometimes see this as qualitatively better than everybody else. And they do infer a hierarchy. But Jesus says over and over in Scripture that his kingdom doesn't work like the world's. His gospel is really good news, because the truth of the matter is, all the power has always resided with him. just as he told the king of Babylon, I give the kingdom to whom I will, and you can't have it. And this might seem so difficult to you. How are we supposed to live selflessly all the time? Servant of all, slave of all? That's not exactly on the poster outside, right? And go, what does it say? Come and make real friends or something? Yeah, hey, and that happens here. But man, I don't know, Jesus would probably put a sign next to that one and become servant of all people. And I don't know if there'll be people rushing from Portland into this space to learn how to serve their neighbor. But I will tell you this, that that's exactly who the church is supposed to be. And here is the real good news, is that you're going to fail. And it's okay. Because Cain failed. The king of Babylon failed. But there is still grace, and there always has been grace. Jesus wasn't the first one to bring grace into this story. Just like Adam and Eve, when they failed and realized their nakedness, God takes a sacrifice of animals, skins them, and clothes them. And then in the story of Cain, this is in Genesis 4, Cain said to the Lord, he says, my punishment for what I've done is too great that I cannot bear it. I cannot keep living. People are going to come after me. He says, you've driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I'm going to be hidden. I'm going to be a fugitive and wander on the earth. And if they find me, they're going to kill me. And then the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put this mark on Cain, lest anyone who found him should attack him. And then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain is given a mark, and it's not a curse, as I've heard some people say. It is a blessing from God. It is his grace. Cain is given a mark that protects him from anyone taking vengeance or retribution for what he's done. It is the very same grace that God gives us in the gospel. Here in this story, it is the clothes that cover Adam and Eve. It is the mark that protects this man from his sin. And then in Daniel, chapter 4, verse 34, after those seven kind of seasons that Nebuchadnezzar's running around like the man-beast bird, at the end of the days, this is even written in first person, he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, because of course he is still that proud, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven and my reason returned to me. I looked beyond myself, back to the Creator, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever, because his rulership is an everlasting rulership. His kingdom endures for generations and generations. My kingdom doesn't. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven, among the inhabitants of earth, and none can stop his hand or say to him, what have you done? And it says this, at the same time that I did this, at the same time I recognized why I was created and designed and who God is, at that moment, my reason returned to me. And for the glory of my kingdom and my majesty and the splendor, it all returned to me. My counselors and my lords, they sought me, and I was established in my kingdom once again, and still more greatness was even added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. And so even in this moment, God shows grace to this man, who's not great. He's enslaved an entire nation of people. But in this brief moment of clarity, God honors him and blesses him. And band, you can come up. Church, it's only by the grace of God that we can do this. Who we are as Christ followers is a people who use our power of God's Spirit, his very Spirit, to serve our neighbor. not to make them lower than us, and not to make ourselves greater than them. But the very gospel message is that we, as Jesus, his very body, provide hope to this world. That when people meet us, we serve them and lift them up greater than us. And when we build things, we praise and honor God for what God's doing. We give thanks directly to where it belongs. Because Jesus taught us to be greatest in his church means this. And it's by living in love towards your neighbor. By being in that space, you will experience the very moving power and love of God in your own life. As we look to each other, as Scripture says, to outdo one another in honor and in service.